Okay. When you're trying to troubleshoot something, when we look at the skin, when we select the geometry and we see over here that everything is grayed out, that means that it is bound to a skeleton. However, when I grab different joints, we see that it doesn't look like any of these are influencing it all. Now, there's a very simple reason why, but instead of me just pointing it out, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can sort of work through our problems, okay? Now, there's a couple of things that we've talked about in class, specifically on when do we know things are influencing other things. So if we look, if I were to select this joint, and this joint here was actually supposed to be controlling this geometry, we would assume something very important would be happening. So what is it that we would expect this shape, this piece of geometry, to actually do at this point, if in fact this joint or this joint was affecting it? Now obviously I'm not just going to sit around and not give you the answer, but I hope that you said it should turn pink. Now watch what happens when I grab that root joint. When I grab the root joint, everything turns pink. Now what that tells me is that all of the geometry is in fact bound, but the problem is that it's only bound to that joint. It's because when I select anything else, I see very quickly that nothing else is turning it pink. So that tells me that when you created that initial smooth bind or rigid bind, whichever one you were using, hopefully in this case, if it's all different pieces, you're going to choose the smooth bind for the organic deforming. But this is the only joint that's actually making this move. So the first thing that we need to do is we just need to take off. So I'm just going to say show none and then just show polygons. I'm just going to highlight everything. Oh, okay. Well, eventually I'll have to, turn all that stuff off. But I'll grab everything that I can. I'll go over to my animation and I'll say detach skin. Now when I do that, we select it and we can see that it is no longer grayed out. That means that these things are no longer locked away and I can start editing them. Now keep in mind, this is one of those things that can really trip you up. We see that this leg there's a piece of geometry. If I just come over here and say smooth shade only the selected object, we can see that we have the entire piece of geometry for the other leg going all the way down. But if this character is indeed like a cyborg, it may not be necessary, because you can see that this geometry versus this geometry, they're basically the same thing. So once you're happy with that geometry, I would suggest just going right in there and taking out any pieces that might be fighting you. Now when I say fighting you, what I'm saying is these two pieces, because they're basically the exact same shape, it's really unnecessary to have this other piece. So I would say that overall, since you already have another one, I would just grab it maybe from here. Make sure I got it all the way around. Yep. And then just use the shift and the greater than key to get all the way up. And then I would simply try to match this piece of geometry, or maybe there's a use for that first line, so I'll just take that off. And then I'll just delete it. Because we have all of this other geometry. It looks like you duplicated it, but you never extracted it from the original shape. So that's not a big deal, but without that, it's going to be so much easier to control this piece without having this other geometry sort of poking in between it. Because remember, there's always something that you can do that can help out with that. Excuse me. So little things like this are just, just make sure that they're far enough out that they aren't going to cause you any problems, so you can see that these little pieces, just real simple things. And I would suggest taking care of this, before you get into the actual rigging part, which is really why the assignment suggested that you make something simple. That way you aren't focusing so hard on the geometry. But that being said, let's just move on. We have the pieces that we feel looking right? Oh, anytime that you get these little sort of wireframe-ish sort of objects, usually that if you right-click and just assign a different shader to it, they'll usually come back. These are most of the time taken, it's either a construction history issue or, maybe your computer just sort of glitched out or had issues. Sometimes it's just because you've got several of them and you've duplicated them more than once. Be extra careful with anything that you make out of booleans, just because booleans are sometimes they can have some results that you're not quite expecting. So just be aware of that. It's not a big deal again. So obviously, looking at this, I would say that your geometry was working. Some of it, if this was supposed to be going all the way around the breast, then you would be making sure that all of those different bits and pieces are actually modeled the way that you want to. If this is a character that wouldn't have anything else, if she was just going to be wearing this, then once you've duplicated everything over and got it the way that you want to, this breast might actually be removed so that the metallic breastplate is the only thing there. Just another one of those situations. Same thing with the leg, just to avoid things having to penetrate through different objects, just poke through and stuff like that. All right, so bringing everything back, we're looking at this now, and when I highlight everything, it looks like the only piece is that one piece that I can't select. It's obviously in here somewhere. Maybe it's this one? Yep, it's that one. So I'll just grab that as well, and then skin, detach skin. So now all the pieces have the history removed, and when I select the joints, nothing highlights. Now as soon as I see that nothing highlights, I know for sure that that I'm ready to start re-rigging. Okay. One thing to watch out for, though, doesn't look like you have a joint for the actual head. So if I look at it from the side view, keep in mind that when we're building the spine up into the neck, all of these things are working okay. You just also have to make sure that they're in the middle, where they're supposed to be, so that the joints aren't having to reach quite so far. And the nice thing about this is, right now I'll probably have to rebuild the IK handles and things like that, but at least because the skeleton is not connected to the geometry right now, I can make adjustments to it. And this is one of those situations where, like I've said in the past, if it's not really, I know that that's really where the spine is, that's where the spine exists in the human body, but we do have to bring it in a little bit so that these joints don't have to reach out so far and sometimes get confused about when you start to bend things forward and backwards. Same thing with the legs. I would probably suggest maybe bringing them in a little bit towards the center, because what you're really doing, again, remember, it's not about trying to mimic a skeleton. It's about trying to build these objects specifically for the purposes of making the machine sort of run the way that you want to. You know what I mean? So I think what I'll do right quick is just get rid of those IK handles. It might help me just to smooth some of these things out. I'm going to just delete one of the arms since this one looks like it didn't go quite as flaky. So what I'm going to do is just grab all of the bones here. So I have this bone, the elbow, and then the forearm. And I'm just going to set everything and make sure that everything is back to rotation of 0, because at some point, the rotations were getting kind of confused. So now that that's the way that it needs to be, let's do this. Now that the rotations are at 0, I'm going to rotate the arm, and I'm just going to bend it into the position that she would naturally put her arm. Okay, so if she was going to just sort of go relaxed from this position, this would be the direction that the joint would naturally want to go into. So it doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be enough to tell the computer this is where you prefer to go. So we say set preferred angle, and now I can reselect those, just highlight over all of them and hit 0. So now she's back to where she wanted to be. And at this point in the situation, your skeleton is totally fine. But just remember, in the future, it might be better to have this a little bit lower. That way you have a controller that can actually be a shoulder roll, which we haven't really gotten into as of right now. Remember, it's only week 6, but those are some things that you may want to consider in the future, and we'll be getting into that more. So if that goes a little bit beyond what you're expecting, that's not a problem. One thing to watch out for, and this can actually be a reason that the joints are a little confused. This one is, notice how the IK handles elbow controllers, they're pretty much in the right space, but they didn't get frozen. So I'm just going to freeze transformations. Oh, that was strange. Are you in a group? Oh, you are. Okay, let me ungroup those real quick, grab them, and then freeze transformations. I'm not going to parent them to anything just yet. I'm just going to make sure that this is working the way that I expect it to. Alright, so real quick, back to this. I'm going to grab a joint, click right on there, and it's just going to say I want to continue making joints from there, and then just go to the top of the head. So basically, remember, this little bone way up here, this is the tip of the finger. This is the thing that doesn't mean anything, but we definitely need a joint for the head itself. Now I can hold down my D key and just adjust it a little bit so that I'm now rotating from the top of the neck. But just be aware that if this is the bone that you want... Oh, wait a minute. I think you're... we got a little bit of an issue, I think. Let's bring this down. So we've got... Okay. Tell you what, I'm going to hide the geometry real quick. I'm going to take this, and instead of putting it in the neck, I'm going to put it down here. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to select the joint that I know I want to reconnect down here, shift, and select the joint that I want it to parent to. Now, the fact that all of this highlighted is completely irrelevant. I have this joint, and I have this joint. So now I can parent it, and notice that now this jumped down here. So that means that when I move my torso, that's totally going to work just fine. But now I have an extra joint that I can use as a neck joint. So I'm going to select that joint, hold down D, and I'm going to bring it to the base of the neck. Now, it would be entirely up to you if you wanted her neck to be able to move more than that. Okay? So what I could do, I could, in theory, move this one to the base, put this one in the middle, and now I actually have a joint in the middle that might help me to get a smoother neck transition. I'm going to move this one forward. There we go. So I've got 1, 2, and now the head joint. So that means that when she bends her neck, we might get a little bit of a smoother transition, kind of like the fingers. So little things like that are obviously something that you'll work out in time. Looks like we've got, let's see. So from here, I'm going to duplicate it over. And so right now it looks like you're using the R, so I'm going to go over to Skeleton Mirror Joint, and I'm going to say look for anything called R and change it with L. And I'm going to duplicate it based on behavior. So when I hit Mirror, that's what we've got. Good stuff. Okay. So, okay, we're still good. All right. So this one should be bending in the same direction when I do this. There we go. See that? So that means that when I pull it down, they both go down. That's what I want. The behavior, not necessarily the actual orientation, and that's totally fine. It works. Okay, so let's bring back the geometry, and now what we have is going to work just fine. Let's see. Now, a couple of extra little things. Keep in mind that this controller should actually... Oh, wait a minute. Is one arm longer than the other? It is possible. Let's double check this. So I'm going to go into Create, Measuring Tools, Distance, and I'll say from you to, I'll say, well, let's just say the wrist. Okay, so that's 462. So now I'm going to grab and just slide it over. So I'm looking for 462. So we'll snap there. Put that right at the wrist. Oh yeah, look at that. It's 4-3. Okay, so your one arm is just ever so slightly shorter than the other. I mean, it is a robotic arm, so if you don't mind that fact, then it's okay. But you know, I'm not sure how that happened exactly. But there's a couple of things that I could do. Probably the easiest one would just be to scale it from this point out. So if I just pushed it a little bit, maybe I can make it fit to your original hand. And see, and honestly, and this isn't to just, you know, gripe or anything, but this is really why we wanted to focus on a simple piece of geometry, just so that this wasn't the part that sort of tripped us up. Remember, there's going to be plenty of time to focus on crazy amounts of detail, which of course will invite new problems. But so there's little things like that that we have to watch out for. But I'm just going to get rid of this. So, all right. The next thing that we have to watch out for is where our controls are. When I grab this one, it should honestly just be sitting right there on that joint. So if I say use X-ray joints, oops, not X-ray, X-ray joints. I'm going to hold down V and I'm going to snap, and I'm going to make absolutely sure that it is that bone that I've actually snapped to. If I don't have it snapped to that bone, then I'm not going to be moving my wrist the way that I want to. Okay, so snap, and just be careful because, you know, it might be something that looks almost right, but when you look at it from a different angle, you realize that it was snapping to a different piece of geometry. So I'm going to hold down V and make sure that it really is snapping to that joint. Okay, so grab those, freeze transformations on those, then I'm going to grab my IK handles. Now, for the entire arm, what's the kind of joint that we actually want? Is it the IKS or the IKR? Let's sip a little coffee here. Remember, S means simple, and this R is for rotate plane, which means that if I want it to be able to rotate like a ball bearing or a ball and socket, basically the shoulder and the hip, I'm going to use the IKRP. So I'll click there. Alright, so we see that when that happened, we get just a little bit of a roll. But honestly, as soon as I create this pole vector, as long as the pole vector controller is sitting in the right place, chances are when I turn on my pole vector, notice how the hand did snap just a little bit. So I have two choices. The first is to just go into the IK handle. So here I have the IK handle selected, and there's this little twist controller. And as I start to increase the number, you notice how it just gets a little bit shifted over. That might be all I need to do. In most cases, when this happens, just a little bit of a twist control usually solves the issue. Now there is a much more technical method, and notice that I twisted it, and now I have to twist it back because the pole vector has sort of overshot it. So ever so slightly, I mean negative 2.2 is the only amount of rotation that I would have to do. Okay, so now I have my IK handle. My IK handle will be parented to that controller. That way I can move it around. We're good to go. And remember that you know, you can do this in different orders. If you're trying to get the rigging to work properly, you know, you can start with that. That's not a big deal. If you already want the character to be rigged together with the skin, that's totally fine too. Alright, so I'm going to select the root joint, shift, and select that main body. So I'm going to go to Skin, Bind Skin, and go to Smooth Skin. Now remember, we have two choices. I can either do just the selected joint. Now remember, if I have this and it looks highlighted, if I go into my hypergraph, is the entire skeleton actually selected? No, it's not. So it says, because it is set to selected joint, I am only going to connect this root joint to the entire piece of geometry. Usually not something we're really looking for. Okay, so there's a couple of things that we can do. From the root joint, what I have selected, I can simply go to Edit, Select Hierarchy, and when I do that, you'll notice that now everything is highlighted. Now there's some things in here that I don't necessarily need. For example, the effector, that's actually the little piece of connection from the IK handle. And I don't necessarily need all of these nulls because they're just going to get in my way. So I'm just going to shift and click all of these off. And I can do it quickly just by grabbing all the ends. So I know that once I see all the little ends, chances are that's going to be just fine. Now, this is the reverse foot. The reverse foot should not... Wait a minute. Or is that right foot? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. At first I saw the R. I thought maybe that was the reverse foot. It's not. So now I have all of the joints for the body. I'm going to, once again, shift and select that piece of geometry. Okay? And then, keeping 2 max influence is just fine with something like this, and I'm going to hit bind. Now this time, when I select that root joint, of course it looks pretty much the same, but when I select this arm, this also turns pink. When I select this arm, this shoulder section also turns pink. So what that means is the pieces of geometry that I'm actually selecting are in fact going to control this. Alright, so now when I move my arm, that's what we've got. Now obviously there's some paint weights that I'm going to have to deal with to make sure that that's as good as we can. And of course at this point, you know, this is a very simple rig. We haven't gotten into the really complicated type of rigging yet. There's all kinds of different things that can fix that to make you know, volumes, you know, not smushed together like this. And we're going to cover all of that later. So just remember that when you're going to create a connection, so for example, let's just assume that I have taken the time to put this hand where these fingers say they want to be. I'm going to grab this joint, or maybe actually start here. Always start one extra one that you think you might not need. And then I'll shift and select the arm, go into my smooth, and then not selected joint, right? We have to make sure that what we have selected is the whole hierarchy from this point down. And then with those, we hit bind. And so now as I move it around, now my arm is working. And see, this is what I was talking about, you know, with pieces sort of popping in and out of each other. Those are just things that you'll have to watch out for. And in the future, we're going to talk about you know, different little tricks that you can do with that. Same thing goes with the head. You know, right now the chin thinks that it's probably this joint that's supposed to tell it what to do. So that's all more or less a paint weights issue. You'll be taking care of that. That's not a big deal. And then same thing with this. I would grab, you know, from the top of the leg, I'll just say select the hierarchy, and I'll, whoops, there she is. I'll grab the whole leg and say smooth bind. So then I can grab that and test it out. There we go. Okay. Now for each one of these little pieces, they don't have to be smooth bound because they don't have to smoothly transition between your joints. So I can say rigid bind based on the selected, hit bind. And now when I look at it wireframe, I can see that those pieces have been connected. And when I move them around, now they're moving together. Now this right here, this is a paint weights issue on this piece of geometry, not these. Remember, this piece has to be smooth weighted so that it always stays behind that other object. Okay, so overall, you were really close. There was just a couple of little things that if you sort of go back and troubleshoot, you know, if say when you select it, you might even want to write it down. Say, okay, this is what I want to happen. And what you would write down is when I select the forearm is told to move. And when you select the forearm, if this didn't turn pink, well, you already know that that's probably where the problem's coming from. So troubleshooting, I think, is, you know, there's an art form to everything, and troubleshooting is definitely one of them, especially when we're talking about rigging. So overall, I think you really don't have that much to worry about. There was just a couple of little issues in this particular rig, and I think that once you get everything the way that you want to, I think it'll work just fine. Now remember, with all of these controllers here, I know you probably haven't made it that far. I'm just going to grab a couple, duplicate, and snap it to each one of those individual neck and the head joint. So let's make sure that I got that in the right place. No, okay. See, there it is. See, there's one of those things where you just double check and make sure that it really is snapping to where you think you want it to go. There we go. So I'll just scale those a little easier. I can shape these into something that's a little easier to grab a hold of. Obviously, we don't want it to just stick out from her head, but for now, I'm just going to leave them the way they are. I'll freeze transforms, and then we just do this. The top one gets parented to the next one. This one gets parented to the one below that. That one gets parented to the one below that. That one gets parented to the one below that. That one gets parented to the one below that. And then this one gets parented to that main move. And now this guy, we're going to make sure that the rotation, the actual rotation point, is right there. Now, this way, when we grab the hips, we'll really be able to swivel her hips. Now, this whole move thing technically doesn't need to be in that place, but I'm going to put it right there anyway. Now, that means that this particular rotation curve doesn't actually have to be there, because that's more or less the root. I just realized that. So I'm going to take the one above, which is everything else. And instead of parenting it to this one, because I'm planning on getting rid of this one, I'm going to shift and parent it to that one instead. And notice how when I select it, even though this one is selected, it's not controlling everybody else. So that's still parented to this guy, but it's by itself. So I'm going to just get rid of that. So then this guy gets parented to that one. And of course we need to freeze transforms on all of these. So we'll just make sure that everything is like that. Oh, wait a minute, something happened. Where did you go? Okay. So let's see here. Are you parented to anything other than that? No, you're not. So you're frozen. Okay, so if I tried to freeze transformations on that, and he shoots away, what he's really doing is he has shot himself off into Never Never Land. He is so far away from here, I'm not even sure where it ended up. So a solution to this is before we parent anything, so I'm just going to grab both of these things because this one has all of the other ones in the chain, and then of course this guy's all by himself. Hold down Shift and hit P. That way we've unparented, so when I select this, notice how nothing's there. And I'll freeze transformations now, and then I'll freeze transformations now, and then I'll freeze transformations now. Then I can parent everything back to where I want it to be. That way, this little guy is still going to be able to control the hip wiggle, but it's only going to do that. So I'm just going to highlight everything else and say lock and hide. Because we don't need any of those other moves. We aren't planning on moving this guy. We just want to rotate it for that little extra hip wiggle. So I can grab this, and then I'm going to tell this entire skeleton. Now there's two things I can do. I could take the whole skeleton just by selecting it and parent it directly to that curve, or if I'd prefer to keep my curve controls and my skeleton separated, that usually is the way you want to do it, but I can select it, hold down Shift, and select that root joint, go to Constraint, and say Parent Constraint. Now I'll make sure that Maintain Offset is turned on, so when I hit Add, now when I select this, notice how the entire skeleton turned pink? That's a good sign, because now, as I move my Move All, that's what that is, like the move, the animate forward, not the move everything, move and scale. Ooh. Also watch out for this. The geometry should in no way be connected to this, because if I start to pull it around, look what just happened. We don't want that. So let me do this. If I say show none, show polygons. If I just grab all of this, let's look inside of the hypergraph. Ah, there you are. Okay, the problem that we're having here is if I look at everything, see, this is definitely not the way that we want this. The body, remember, the body is the geometry, right? So I don't want that parented to the move controls at all, because this is part of the geo group. So watch. The geo and the move. Okay, that's move all, I'm assuming, right? Yes. So I'm going to call that move all. So the move all and the geometry can be grouped together so that they're just organized, but notice how I'm never going to move this group. This is simply going to be the character organize group. Now you don't necessarily have to call it that, but hopefully that explains what that thing does. So we have the move all, which this guy right here is your actual move, like root or move center of your character. That's also going to be parented to that move all. Okay, so these two pieces here, this gets parented to the move all. That way, see, I can still move my character. Remember, all these other pieces we haven't rigged, but everything that we did rig is moving. So why in the world are those pieces of geometry moving, even though the group with the geometry is not even part of it? Well, because those pieces have history that says, wherever you go, joints, that's where I'm going. So we need to make sure that the geometry is never part of those actual animation curves. Now keep in mind, you might see some sort of, in some cases when you download a rig, the geometry might look like it's part of the rig, but it really depends on who built it and how they did it. Because in some cases, animators, like especially on certain rigs, they don't really care about the complexities of rigging. They just want those objects to move. So in some cases, they could just be really messy. In other cases, they could have done something that required it. There are always exceptions to the rules, but I'm trying really hard to get everybody to sort of focus and see how this works. Okay? So overall, it's really close, but with just a little bit of this one really is close. So, you know, troubleshooting, just look at it, try to be logical about it, say what is it that I want to happen. So for example, if I said I want this joint to bend whenever I rotate this, well, you would say, okay, you can do that. You select the curve, select the head, go constrain, and then just say orient constrain with the maintain offset on. So we hit add, and then we can do the next one. Do it again. So that way, this will control the looking up and down and the rotating of the head side to side. Now remember, we still didn't do the paint weights, so some of this might not look perfect, but that's okay. Then G to do it again, select this one, select that one, G to do it again, select this one, select that one, G to do it again, and now all of this is working just fine. Okay, I'm going to pull this away just so that we're not concentrating on all the parts we didn't bind yet, but we can see that when I bend forward, that's working just fine. Okay, if we move the arm around, there's still paint weights issues, but that's okay. And with multiple joints, we can sort of arc and bend around. That's good. That's working fine. A little bit of paint weights here and there, but overall, things are going the way that we want them to. Okay, so I can just run this back over to 0. Now with the elbow controls, I would say put them into this back controller, mainly because if we parent them there, anytime the character is going to rotate, the elbow controllers are going to rotate along with them. Same thing as if the character were going to sort of turn to one side or the other, that works just fine. Alright, so nearly there. Again, remember, if it's a complicated rigging assignment and rigging is what we're trying to focus on, just try really hard not to overcomplicate things because that's when problems arise. Okay?